Welcome to the New Normal, the platform for serious talks. My guest today is Wead. He is a New York Times best-selling author and an advisor to two presidents of the United States of America. He was an assistant to the George H.W. Bush. He is the author of more than 30 books, and his most recent book is Inside Trump's Presidency, the real story of his presidency. Welcome to the New Normal, Doug.
Thank you for having me.
What we are hearing from the United States is that the US in social turmoil. First we heard about impeachment stories. Everyday news stories came out saying that the president is going to be impeached. Then COVID-19 came. American system is falling apart and they cannot manage this pandemic, they said. And now the story of killing of George Floyd, which is unfortunate, of course. The media reporting saying that the public life in the United States is in limbo. But Trump is doing nothing. What is your take on this current situation?
Well, actually, all the economists expected us to lose 7 million jobs in this last report. And instead, we gained several million jobs. It was a shock. Nobody expected it. So the president has obviously been doing something. And the economy has made a sharp jump back to where it was. That's one of the most compassionate things a leader can do, is provide jobs to its people. And the coronavirus was a great hit for countries all over the world, and it was in the United States. The United States has a large number of cases because the United States tests a large number of its population. And so we went through quite a crisis here. Pandemic, one of the three greatest in history. You have to go back to the 14th century, the 13th century, the bubonic plague, and then the Spanish flu, influenza, just during World War I, to find anything to compare to this. So it's pretty remarkable.
But people are on the street. Millions of them are coming against the president. I'm afraid, as far as the public health is concerned, if there is a second wave of this pandemic, what will happen to the states? It will be another nightmare.
Well, there's a bit of a political nightmare because some politicians, especially Democrat politicians, liberal politicians, who've wanted to see the American economy crash, some of them have publicly said that they wanted to see a recession because they felt it would help them unelect Donald Trump in the next election. Some of them were wanting the American economy to close down, and it was a bit of a dilemma. When this terrible thing happened to Mr. Floyd, suddenly these people who could have been arrested, I live in Virginia, you could be arrested here in Virginia, according to the governor. If you step out of your house without a face mask, you can be arrested. 2 months ago, they were saying face masks don't work. And now you can go to jail if you're wearing a face mask. You can go to jail if you go to a church, but you can go to a liquor store and you can burn down a church and loot Target and go out with big TV sets if you're demonstrating for the cause that the mayor of the city and the governor of the state approve of. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
Before we are going into the detail, I want to ask you this. If President Trump is doing this much well, why every media, well, let's say almost every media, is attacking him?
Donald Trump was first elected. The national media in America didn't like it. The left didn't like it. The big monopolies didn't like it. They're making a lot of money the way things are with the Republican establishment, with the Democrat establishment. Here was an outsider, Donald Trump, coming into power. And the big monopolies were no longer getting the special deals from the Federal Reserve, from the Import-Export Bank, They were no longer getting all of the contracts without any competition from the federal government. They had given money to the Clinton Foundation. They expected to be repaid with big government contracts. Boeing is an example. Now, all of a sudden, Boeing had 40 competitors saying, we can build it better and quicker for less money. The big monopolies own the television networks and the newspapers. And so that's what he's up against. Just keep in mind, the first 3 years of his presidency, he was accused of being a Russian spy. Now think of that for a minute. The Russians supposedly, according to the New York Times and the American media, the Russians anticipated and planted him as a spy and got him elected president of the United States with $200,000 worth of Facebook ads. This is the story that the national media in America preached for 3 years. Now, if that happened, if that was true, that would be one of the greatest events of world history. That would equal the assassination of Julius Caesar. That would be like the crossing of the Atlantic, Columbus. It works like this. If you're a big company with a lot of money, you have a powerful lobby, and you give that money to senators and congressmen and presidential candidates, and when they get in power, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they do things to favor you. Things like create regulations that cause small businesses to be non-competitive. If you want to open up a restaurant, you have to meet all of these new regulations. A big restaurant chain can afford to do that, but you're just a mom and a pop, you can't.
Yeah.
The big restaurant chain can get money from the federal government. When I was in the White House in the Bush administration, McDonald's Corporation came to us and wanted $100 million in federal money. Stop and think of that. If you open a hamburger joint, your taxes are going to subsidize your competitor down the street. And then we learned through the Federal Reserve that creates money, we learned that McDonald's, during the recession in 2008, the government came to the lobbyists and said, create jobs. How can you help us create jobs? And the lobbyist for McDonald's said, well, give us some money so that we can expand our businesses and we'll create jobs. So more than $100 million was given to McDonald's by the Federal Reserve. I'm using them as an example. I don't have anything against them. 0% interest, 0% interest. So they were able to refinance all their old debt and build new restaurants all across America, all to create jobs, $7 an hour jobs. But the end result of everything I'm describing to you, the end result is you can't start your own business. You can't compete with the big monopolies. So when Donald Trump came to power, he promised that he would deregulate, he would break these regulations. Now, I learned working 40 years for the Bush family and in the White House, they don't keep the regulations anyway, these big monopolies. What happens is there's a recession and they pass a stimulus bill. Under Barack Obama, they passed a stimulus bill. It's 2,000 pages long. And once again, the legislators go to the lobbyists who have the money, who represent the big monopolies, and say, how can you help us stimulate the economy? We need jobs. And the lobbyist will say, well, you've got all these regulations on us. If you will give us a 10-year period where we don't have to keep these regulations, we can create jobs. And that's what happens. So under the stimulus program, they're allowed to be free from these regulations. But you and your wife and your family, if you want to start a business, you have to keep those regulations. And add another layer, globalism, and add another layer, China. Almost all of these companies are working with China. So when you ask, why does the national media, why are they so dishonest towards Trump and why are they so relentless in attacking Trump? Disney makes much of its money off China. Almost 40% of its income comes from China. Disney owns ABC. What is ABC News going to do?
Right.
In NBC Evening News, brought to you by McDonald's. What are they going to do? So that's why Donald Trump is hated, and that's why there's so many of these false stories continually, constantly about him. That's why they wanted to convince the world he's a Russian spy.
All right. Now the protests are going under the slogan of Black Lives Matter. But we have been taught, since the Declaration of Independent Science in 1776, is that all lives matter, isn't it?
Well, that may be that may be the case, but what's happening here in the United States, again, promoted by the national media and by the left in the United States, is that Black Lives Matter only, and not just all Black Lives Matter. For example, there was the death of Mr. Floyd, which was so tragic and heartbreaking, but there was the death of Mr. Dorn. He was a 77-year-old Black man who was protecting a Black-owned business that was being looted, and he was shot to death and killed. There's no outcry. There's no news coverage or story.
When was this incident happen?
This happened during the demonstrations and the riots following the death of Floyd.
Right.
So it's not just that all Black Lives Matter, it's some Black Lives Matter.
Great. Yes, I just recall it's in Animal Farm by George Orwell.
Well, let's talk about your work. I understand we can't talk all of them in this program. Hopefully we can have another meeting for another episode. In one of your statements, you said that most of the presidents in the states are mama's boys.
Yeah, that's true. That's interesting phenomena. I just connected the dots. I didn't go into that study with a presupposed idea, but I noticed so many of the presidents very close to their mother, and so many of them, not all of them, have an absent father. So they were close to their mother, had an absent father. In fact, many of them were actually named after their mother. Ronald Wilson Reagan was named after his mother, Nellie Wilson. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, named after Sarah Delano. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy, named after Rose Fitzgerald. This goes all the way back into history. Rutherford Burchard Hayes, named after Sophia Burchard. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, named after his mother, Rebecca Baines. Richard Milhouse Nixon, named after his mother, Hannah Milhouse. It's just extraordinary. And even the ones who weren't named after their mothers were very close to their mothers, with a couple of dramatic exceptions. And that was just interesting to me. Obama was a mama's boy with an absent father. And even those who appeared to be close to their father, like George W. Bush, they came to George H.W. Bush and they said, "Aren't you proud of your son? You must have been a great father to your son to become president." He said, "I never saw him. Barbara raised him. It wasn't me, it was Barbara. He was gone all the time."
One of your books is about presidential children. What did this tell you about their fathers?
Yeah, the lives of presidential children are tough. It's tough anytime you have a successful father. It's hard to live up to them. And if you're a namesake, we know from studies, from psychological studies, if you're named after your father, you tend to be more successful. It's like also tall people make slightly more money than short people like me. So we know that statistically, but if you're named after your father and your father was president, it's like a curse. They die young, they die of alcoholism. John Tyler Jr. and William Henry Harrison Jr. Died in their 20s of alcoholism. Andrew Jackson Jr. died in a hunting accident. Sometimes they're freak accidents. Calvin Coolidge Jr. died at the age of 16 after an accident on the White House tennis courts. I wrote this study for George W. Bush, whose dad had just been elected president. And he said, great, thanks a lot. After I wrote that, I was listening to the radio in my car, and they announced on the radio that John F. Kennedy Jr., his airplane had disappeared over the Atlantic. And I had chills go down my spine. I thought, wow, here we go again. This has happened all through history. This has happened, and here it is again with John F. Kennedy Jr. So it's an interesting phenomenon. There's something, I don't know if it's a despair, it's a feeling that how can I live up to what my father has accomplished? And if they become self-destructive, some people say they become daring, that they'll try anything. You know, my dad was president, I can do this, and they'll try to do something that's hard to do. But it's an interesting study.
Yeah, you have written a nice book with late President Bush Sr. when he was the vice president. Man of Integrity, the title of the book.
If I'm correct.
Yes.
But end of his presidency, we all know that his presidency was not successful. He was not re-elected. He is responsible for dropping 85,000 tons of bombs on Iraq and Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. Mostly civilians were killed. What is your response? You are known as the man behind some of his crucial political decisions.
Well, I think that George H.W. Bush, he made it clear that Iraq could not just invade Kuwait, and he drove them out of Kuwait, and he didn't finish off Saddam Hussein. A lot of people criticized him for that, said you were there, you should have finished him off. But now we see the wisdom of why he made that decision, because his son came in and finished off Saddam Hussein, and it upset the whole equilibrium of the Middle East, Sunni and Shia, and it's been a disaster ever since, the result of which almost 300,000 people have died, including 30,000 children have died. So it shows the nightmare of what happened with the son, George W. Bush. But George H.W. Bush, he helped end the Cold War. He didn't get reelected, as you point out, but there was a third party that split the vote, and that was part of the reason.
Then we have had the first African American president, Barack Obama. He has ruled the country for 2 terms. His slogan was, "Yes, we can." What happened at the end?
Yeah, Barack Obama is going to be beloved by history and will be a great figure of history. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Hadn't even done anything. He just got elected. He was embarrassed.
And he donated that money.
He said, don't give it to me. I haven't done anything yet. But it's a good thing he took it, because he probably wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. But he will always be beloved in the United States because he's our first African-American president. And that's a source of great pride to many Americans, regardless of what happened to the economy. But there's no question that when it came to the economy, all of Obama's economists, all of the world's economists said that Donald Trump's projections of what the economy would do were false, and they were all wrong, and Trump was right. And you remember Barack Obama's plan with ISIS was to degrade. He said he wanted to degrade ISIS. He wanted to make it difficult for them to recruit new ISIS fighters. And to do that, he felt that the United States should be much nicer to Islamic terrorists and never call them terrorists. So all across the United States during Obama's time, none of the news media, no one publicly would refer to Islamic terrorism, because Obama didn't want us to say that. He wanted us to be beloved by the Islamic world.
Now about the Trump administrations. Right from the beginning, he came under severe criticism. Everybody is criticizing him. Trump is a dictator, Trump is a racist, he is not respecting rule of law, and Trump is killing the American dignity. I think you are one of the best person to answer these questions. You are the person who has direct access to him, who has chance to talk to him and listen to his story. And what is your take about this?
Yes, you know, it's interesting. He just tweeted about me today at 12:40 a.m. while I was sleeping. He's just extremely honest. He calls things the way he sees them. A good example of that is his policy toward India. It's a very good example.
When was the first time you met him?
I met him during the campaign and just visited with him briefly. And then I was hosting, this is a great story I'm about to tell you. Nobody knows this story, but it's so typical of, it's so contrary to what they would imagine about Donald Trump. I had in my home some students from Nigeria, African students from the country of Nigeria. They filled my home where I am right now. There were, I believe, 10 Nigerian students. And my wife and I were helping them get their visas straight, to get scholarships, to go to high schools in the United States. And so they were with me, and the president heard about it. Ivanka Trump heard about it, and she wanted to meet him.
Was it during the campaign?
No, it was after he was president.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
So we said, okay. So we brought these two of the girls in to meet with Ivanka, and she hugged them and sat down and wanted to hear their stories and visited with them. And she immediately, after hearing their stories, she took them downstairs. Her office is upstairs in the West Wing. She took them downstairs to the Oval Office to meet the president. And we sat there and visited with the president, my wife and I and daughters, and these Nigerian students. And, you know, you heard people say, well, he's a racist, he's a dictator, as you said, all these things.
Right.
It was not my experience at all. He's the one that initiated and wanted to meet these young ladies. He was very moved by her. And at the end of this young lady's discussion with the president, she did most of the talking. He just listened. At the end of it, she said, "God bless you, Mr. President." And he turned to her, he said, "No, God bless you." It was a very touching and a very interesting moment. And that's typical Donald Trump. I'll tell you this, a dictator, the idea that Donald Trump is a dictator shows great lack of intelligence and knowledge of history. A dictator controls the media. Nobody would suspect that Donald Trump controls the media. And a dictator controls academia. They dictate the curriculum. Stalin did, Hitler did. Nobody would say that Donald Trump controls the American academia, that he dictates the curriculum at Harvard or Stanford or the University of California in Berkeley. They hate everybody in those universities and colleges. And a dictator controls motion pictures. Stalin used to actually read the movie scripts and personally approve them in the Soviet Union during the war, because it impacted morale and propaganda. In Nazi Germany, an actor or actress couldn't appear in a movie without the personal approval of Joseph Goebbels. That's how a dictatorship works. Donald Trump is not a dictator.
You have published a book, Inside Trump's White House, the real story of his presidency, in last November. Beginning of the book, you recall your memory of having lunch with him. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, that was so interesting. They first they said I could write the book. I had said, look, in a couple hundred years, they're still going to be writing books and making motion pictures about the Trump family. And either you're going to be viewed with bitterness and hatred and fear like the Borgias or the Medicis, a powerful political rich family, or you're going to be beloved like the Kennedys or the Rockefellers. It all depends on primary sources and on what the president himself says and what you say. So I shared that with Ivanka, and and I told her, I want to write that book. I want to write a book that captures the voices, the primary sources.
How did you get the approval to write this book?
I had to get the approval first that I could do the book. And that came the very next Friday. The Trumps were in New York, and Ivanka called me on the phone and said, congratulations, you can write your book. But I didn't get an interview with the president. The press secretary called me in and said, okay, we're going to set up a meeting with the president for you, and you'll be able to interview him and get started on your book. We're going to run it by General Kelly, who was the chief of staff. And they're meeting Monday to discuss how to do this. Well, Monday came and they didn't let me write the book. It didn't happen. So I don't know if it was General Kelly or what happened. I had worked in the White House, so I was very familiar with White House politics. It's very Byzantine and complicated and lots of egos. So I wasn't surprised, but I didn't get a chance to interview him then. And several months passed, and General Kelly left the White House, and there was a brief period in between, and boom, that's when they had it. They had me in, and they must have been debating whether or not to allow me to voice record the president, because I'm the guy that tape recorded George W. Bush. So they must have had a lot of misgivings, and I like primary sources too much, I guess. So they must have been debating how much access do we give this Doug Wead character. And that morning, I was on Fox and Friends early in the morning. The president saw me, and they were asking me about the State of the Union address and how the president's State of the Union address compares to Lyndon Johnson's State of the Union address. And I said, well, Lyndon Johnson was promising food stamps. Donald Trump is giving them a job. There's a big difference. And Donald Trump was watching. So when I came in the Oval Office that morning, he had decided, yes, he can interview me. He can have access to everybody in the White House. Yes, he can tape record me.
Who's the smartest man in Trump's White House?
Well, if you said who, it would be the president. And I know some
Next to
people are
president.
shocked by that. I hear what you're saying. But I was a bit surprised how smart he is, because he's always telling us he's smart, so we tend to discount it. But he is really sharp. He's right on the money in so many ways. I would say, other than the president, without any question, Jared Kushner is just brilliant. And it's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of other people that I interviewed, and ambassadors and cabinet officers. He is logical. He's analytical. The foreign minister of Mexico said, I never met anybody with better clarity of thought than Jared Kushner.
In the meantime, one of his sons, Trump Jr., published a book, Triggered. Have you read it?
Yes.
Okay, at
Yes,
the beginning of the book, he said, I'm not mad.
And then he talked about the left movement and how they are scheming against Trump's presidency. What is your take on his book?
Yeah, I think it's a great book, and it's interesting. I was interviewing him at the time he was writing his book. So it was, he wasn't giving interviews to anybody, but we both had the same editors. So he said, I guess it's okay. So I was interviewing him and getting bits and pieces of his story while he was writing his own book. The Trump family is fascinating, each one. Eric is brilliant, and Laura is brilliant, and of course, Don Jr. is brilliant. And I loved Tiffany. I had the only interview with Tiffany Trump since her father became president. And it was wonderful. She's beautiful and she's smart and very thoughtful. And it was a great interview.
By the way, we could not see that much reports or publicity over the operations that killed the ISI leader, like what we have seen during the President Obama's time when they killed Osama bin Laden. Why was that?
The difference is President Obama's policies included strong regulations that kept small business competitors away from the big monopolies and the globalists. And so Obama was loved and protected by the media. But Donald Trump has deregulated and allowed the small businesses to multiply and compete with the big companies. And that has enraged some of the large globalist monopolies. The name of the game is monopoly. That's the game. It's never changed.
Doug, it is time to wrap up this interview. Any final remarks?
Well, I watched a few days ago. I watched the movie Gandhi again. I love the movie. It's a great story, and I love the book Freedom of Midnight, which is a great depiction of Gandhi.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of how history eventually catches up. And I think that's going to happen with the era we're living in now. Historians are going to hold to facts, not the wishes of the national media, the wishes that this is wrong or this is wrong. They're going to go to the facts. And I think Donald Trump's going to fare very well. Jared Kushner once said to me in one of the earlier interviews, he said, "You may not believe this, but there will come a time when Donald Trump will be missed greatly. And there will be bumper stickers, 'Give us back our Trump,' but he'll be gone and it'll be too late." And I think that there will come a time where the world will, again, in America, will want the honesty and the frankness and the purity of Donald Trump's thinking and speaking. It's outrageous. It's shocking.
Give us a prediction. Who is going to win the 2020 elections?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I know who I hope wins, and I know who I'm going to vote for. But I don't know what will happen. The national media and the international media is extremely powerful. I remember visiting the Soviet Union after the collapse, and I would visit with friends who had lived in the Soviet era, and I would say, "What are some of the books that you couldn't read, that were not allowed to read? What movies couldn't you see?" They'd say, "I don't know. I don't know. Tell me about a book and I'll tell you whether I could read it or not. Tell me about a movie. I'll tell you whether I could see it." And I did that, and it didn't always match. It was very different. And they didn't know what they didn't know. And we tend to think, when we have a corrupt media and press, we tend to think we're smart enough to be able to figure out what's really going on and to hear what's really happening in between the lines. But we don't know what we don't know.
All right. It is an honor to have you.
Thank you very much.
Today we talked to Doug Wead. He's a presidential historian in the United States and an advisor for 2 presidents. And he's a acclaimed author, and recently he wrote a book about the Trump. And thank you for watching us, and see you again.